All right, dear participants, speakers, guests, welcome to this webinar arranged by the Center on U.S. Politics and Power at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. My name is Charlie Salonis-Pasternak. I run the center, or I should say I lead it, because it's actually run by Mayu and the people who do all the work. So for that, thank you for financing. Comes from the ERCO Foundation, which has enabled over a past decade the growth and expansion of the center. So thank you to ERCO for that. Today is looking at the list of people who are interested in this topic. I'm not surprised, talking about combining China, surveillance state, technology, just as phrases is bound to be interesting. I will not take any more of your time other than to just quickly run through how we'll run the next hour. I'm briefly going to introduce our FIA non-resident fellow, Leo Michel. He's also a non-resident at the Atlantic Council, although there, I think it's senior fellow, so we're going to have to work on this, Leo, if we get you senior here too. No, but seriously, he's been the director for NATO policy and director for non-nuclear arms control office at OSD in Pentagon, and worked where we, I think, first met at the National Defense University. Most recently, we spent time together about a week ago here in Finland. But Leo is really the person who's going to do the interview and introduce our speaker for today, Jessica Batke. And after about half an hour or so, I'm going to take over in terms of moderating the questions. For all of you listening, watching, please write in your questions into the chat. I think those are the only instructions we're going to give. And with that, welcome, Jessica and Leo. Please take over.
Kitos, Charlie. Hello from Washington. This edition of the Transatlantic Currents is going to discuss the origins, the strategy, the tools, and the applications of China's use of advanced technologies to exert control over a wide range of domestic affairs. Now, perhaps understandably, this subject does not normally attract regular attention in governmental statements on policy toward China, nor for the most part in the media. But thanks to a growing, diverse, and a very dedicated community of non-government China watchers, as we call them, we've learned a lot in recent years about how these controls not only stifle Chinese society, but also have potentially very harmful effects on the international community. So we're delighted today that an American expert on China, Jessica Batke, has agreed to be our guest. Jessica is the senior editor for investigations of China File, an online magazine published by the Asia Society. She joined China File in 2017 after serving as an analyst for nearly 8 years in the US State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Welcome, Jessica. First things first, could you please describe the Asia Society and your work for China File?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much for having me here today, and thanks for everybody who joined us. I'm Jessica Batke. I work at the Asia Society in New York. Asia Society is a non-governmental organization. It's headquartered in New York, and its work touches on a wide range of issues. There's a number of departments working on issues that includes policy, arts and culture, education, business, technology, and importantly for today, Asia Society as an institution takes no policy position. So any views you hear me express today are my own. Within Asia Society, there's a department called China File. That's where I work. We're an editorially independent publication. We seek to promote an informed, nuanced, and vibrant public conversation about China. As Leo said, I've been working there since 2017. The first few years, I was really focused on the impact of the foreign NGO law, which went into effect in 2017. So looking at how Chinese law was impacting international nonprofits that were trying to work in and with China. And for the last few years, I've been focused pretty broadly on issues of governance and identity. So that's taken the form of articles on surveillance, on public opinion polling, public opinion monitoring, and more generally, party efforts to kind of reach as deeply as possible into the grassroots of society to try to forestall unrest.
So, and let me mention that a number of articles done by the China File, including several authored by Jessica, we're going to post the links to those on the chat function at the end of this conversation, so that you can look for yourself and see more detail about these topics. But let me begin, Jessica, with you took a look back in April. You took note of the 10th anniversary of a critical directive that was promulgated by the Chinese Communist Party, which had just come under a few months earlier in November 2012. It had just come under the chairmanship of Xi Jinping, today as well the president of China. So that document, which I point out was not intended for public dissemination, came to be known as Document 9. I wonder, could you describe the significance of that Document 9, especially as it relates to the strategic thinking behind the party's harsh crackdown that took place subsequently against human rights lawyers, against media, academics, and some minorities that we will talk about more in detail?
Yeah. Thank you so much for asking about this, actually. I think this is so important. As you said, Document 9 was issued about a decade ago. And the full title is the Communique on the Current State of the Ideological Sphere. So that already gives you a hint of what this is going to be about. And it's called Document 9 simply because of the numbering system that the party uses for these kinds of documents. And as you said, it was never meant to be public. Someone leaked it. And even though it's a decade old, I still think it's incredibly useful for understanding the foundational assumptions of the current regime. And I think it's really helpful for understanding the ways in which the party thinks about using technology in service of social control. And I encourage folks to go to read that document in full. We have a translation up on China File. It lays out really clearly some of the major themes that we've seen in Xi's tenure. That includes a disdain for genuine grassroots civil society. It says that the party really needs to reassert its control over the media and all messaging. It insists that the party, and the party alone, is the only one that can define the historical narrative, describe and interpret Chinese history. And throughout the document, when you read it, it's really clear that there is a loathing, a fear, a disdain for Western ideas and ideologies, and that's their terminology, Western. And so in essence, this is kind of a roadmap of the problems that the party has sought to address since then. What we've seen in the year since is exactly what you said, Leo. There's been a steady effort to increase controls over civil society, increase controls over media, increase control over those historical narratives. I think one of the most discussed examples of this are laws and regulations put out in the last few years that stop people from defaming the honor of revolutionary heroes, things like that. And those are all in service of this idea that the party needs to be in complete control of how Chinese citizens think about the party and about China generally.
Mm-hmm. So let's focus in a little bit, because I know from your writings and from other articles that I've looked at on this, that the Uyghur community, which represents some 12 million persons, as I understand it, mostly in Xinjiang, has been the target of particularly intense surveillance and repression. And I'm just going to quote back to you the way you described this in one of your articles. You say that in the context of Xinjiang, innovation supports a much more intentionally crafted ecosystem of repressive policies, infrastructure, and technology. The party state, your writing, has deployed cutting-edge technologies from the research and commercial sectors to fashion an unrivaled system of population monitoring, assessment, and control. So I'd like you to take a couple of minutes at least to describe with some examples the techniques, the technologies that have been deployed against the Uyghurs inside and, as I understand it, sometimes outside of China. And what can you say about their effectiveness? And in particular, could you describe what's known as the quote, the integrated grid management platform? I thought this was a particularly fascinating concept.
Yeah, so I'll assume that most people attending today know about, in general, the large-scale atrocities that are being perpetrated against Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples living in northwestern China. I won't go into detail about what those are. The goal so far has not been to implement mass killings of these people, but to do what they call is transforming them. The party would like to transform them into citizens that more closely fit the party's ideal. So, the goal is that Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples feel that they are Chinese first and foremost, and any sort of attachment or display of traditional religion or culture should be cosmetic at best. So that's what they're aiming for. And to impose this incredible level of social control and social transformation, the party has employed a mix, actually, of these new technologies that you were just talking about, and some pretty old school techniques that they've been using for a while. So I'm sure most people have heard about the cameras in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, many that have facial recognition capabilities. They're just everywhere. People may have heard about the Chinese government forcibly taking people's DNA, recording people's voices and facial expressions, taking iris scans. And these are all ways that they can better identify people in a range of contexts. So they're forcibly taking people's biodata and cataloging it. People may have also heard about instances like QR codes being posted by families' doors. This allows police officers or other authorities to scan those QR codes and instantly know who is supposed to be in that house. Are there any potential issues that the authorities have flagged with them? Maybe they go pray too much. Maybe they've crossed county lines recently. And that's a piece of technology, I think, is really important. It's called in Xinjiang, it's called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. Human Rights Watch has done some really great reporting about this. And this is supposed to pull together data from all sorts of places. So if you drive your car somewhere, there's cameras that are able to detect your license plate. So they know where you're driving. That information could be fed in. Where you yourself are going. Again, cameras everywhere. For a while, there was physical checkpoints. So that information also potentially being fed in. Certainly information about your members of your household, your associates, potentially even how you're spending your money, your financial information. So all of that would potentially be fed into this integrated joint operations platform that allows police and other authorities to decide whether they want to monitor you more closely, send someone to your home. I think the really important thing here is that this, level of technology, this IJOP, this is it's a spin on a really old idea. It's a tried and true technique that they've been using throughout China for decades, and that's called the grid management system. That's used, again, throughout China for decades. And the idea here is that you create increasingly smaller units of control. So in a city, you break up into grids and then into smaller grids until you finally get to the bottom, and you would assign a grid worker to be responsible for knowing everything that's happening in they're part of the grid. And in 2016, an official in southern China, so not in Xinjiang, was describing hiring new grid workers. And he said, and I'm just going to quote it here because I think it's really helpful. If a grid administrator is responsible for 200 families, he can roughly remember who is in his grid within 1 month's time and grasp the basic information of each family in about 3 months' time. In 6 months' time, he can count every member of those families. So the goal here is that you have an actual human person who's responsible for 200 people, say, in his grid, and he's supposed to know where they're going, what they're doing, what their daily life is generally like, and he can report up at any time. If anything seems unusual, do they have an unexpected guest? Just knowing what's going on in the grid. And so what we're seeing in Xinjiang is the combination of these sort of more pedestrian, low-tech ideas combined with technology that allows the authorities to impose an even greater level of social control. And I think part of the quote you were reading, Leo, really gets at this idea that the authorities there see this as a moral good, as an improvement. They talk about this kind of surveillance, these technologically enabled surveillance, in the same breath as they're talking about like blockchain or funding maker spaces. So they do see this as a positive development. You asked about outside China. Obviously, the Chinese government cannot place cameras everywhere that there's a diaspora community, but they still do try to monitor people outside of China. A lot of times this takes the effect of reaching out to people on WeChat, which is a Chinese social media platform, and perhaps threatening any family members that are back in China. So they would say to someone in the diaspora, we need you to cooperate, we need you to report back to us on what other people in the diaspora are doing and saying, or else, we will arrest your family members. So even though you're not in China, you're not really free from this, and it is tied to this technology, this WeChat, which is surveilled by the Chinese government. It is not secure.
So there's been some reporting, a lot of reporting actually, on the lockdown, the extensive lockdown because of the COVID pandemic in China. Have the techniques used to monitor the spread of COVID, try to prevent it and so forth, has that been used to increase the Chinese government's reach into even lower levels of city governments? Because in one of the articles that I read, you were interviewing a Chinese expert, Taisu Zheng. I know I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, but the quote that stuck out with me was when they said, looking at the local governance in China right now, compared to, he said, 2011, in the final years of the previous regime, no one can deny that their difference is really dramatic. And the expert went on to say, the feeling of how close the state is to you has just fundamentally changed. Have you seen that as well in your work?
Yeah, and I think that I would encourage actually folks to read this paper by Taisu Zhang, and I believe the link is going to be provided later.
Yes.
This is another example of old school techniques being married with technology to allow the party states to get a more granular ability to surveil its citizens at a more granular level. So the health codes that you're talking about were in effect during the pandemic. They were on your phone. You had to have that on your phone so that people could decide where you could go, whether you were confined to your home, whether you could travel. And even though those are no longer required, first of all, they can spin them back up anytime if they need to. They create a new version of that. But the bureaucratic implementation of greater control at the local level has remained. So I think that this is a really important part. Again, it's this mix of old and new. Prior to COVID, the lowest levels government in China didn't really do much. Tai Su-jung said that when he was a kid, basically you just went to the local level of government to get your milk delivery set up. That's the kind of thing it was doing. And then what we saw during COVID was those levels of government were the ones enforcing the lockdowns that everybody heard about. So they've been vastly empowered they have more funding, they have more people to implement social controls as the party state deems necessary. And Tai Su thinks, and I agree with him, that these are not going to be rescinded anytime soon. So even though the lockdowns aren't happening, even though health codes right now aren't in use, it's very unlikely that those powers are going to be given up. And that's fundamentally because the government is concerned about unrest. I'm sure people here know about the A4 white paper protests last fall. So they're very concerned about that happening again. And so you have at the local level, again, you want people there to monitor what's happening and report up anything that they find unusual.
So there, following up on this, there was a book published last year that I've looked at called The Surveillance State, Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control. The authors, and I should cite the authors, Josh Chin and Lisa Lin. And they also go into some detail describing this sophisticated national database, linking identification documents, facial recognition, etc. They mention that more and more this data is being analyzed in real time by AI, that is artificial intelligence software, sold by a host of Chinese companies. They name several of them: Huawei, SenseTime, Megvei, China Electronics Technology Group Corporation, and so forth. And with this technology from the China, actually tech giants, the security authorities are able to track phones, monitor online purchases, decrypt messages, and so forth. What I found interesting in their book was they name some of them. I'm not going to name them here, but they suggest that commercial connections with Western high-tech corporations have been very useful to the Chinese system. And does your group, the China File, or does the broader China Watcher community, is it actively looking at these connections between the Chinese high-tech giants and, let's say, Western corporations? And if so, are there any preliminary conclusions that one can draw about the strength and the role of the Western companies in actually enabling these social control technologies in China?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a really good book. I also recommend everybody read that book. Yeah, there's a number of people that are looking into this, and I think it's important to think about not just connections between corporations and corporations, but it can go between corporations and governments on either side. And there's a couple famous examples of this, kind of going back to the Xinjiang issue that we were talking about before. There's a really famous example of Thermo Fisher Scientific, who produce DNA equipment. DNA sequencers is apparently not the right word, but I can't remember what the right word is, so I'll just call it DNA, genetic equipment. They were selling those products to the police in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region as they were building up the capacity to forcibly take people's biodata. And Human Rights Watch, again, has done great reporting on this issue. If people are interested in the supply chain issue, I really recommend the Forced Labor Lab at Sheffield Hallam University. So that is partially technology, but it's looking at a bunch of different corporate entanglements, including in the solar industry. I think for a lot of these technologies, whether they're being sold into China or China out, there's a fundamental problem with dual use here. So for example, with the example of the DNA equipment, that has plenty of non-repressive uses, scientific research, medicinal, and that gives companies plausible deniability. They're just selling their equipment. They can't be responsible for how it's used. There's another issue of different laws in different jurisdictions. So someone, a professor in Belgium named Yves Moreau, has done a lot of really great work on this. And he's talked a lot about how if you're, say, an American company selling technology into China, you only have to abide by the laws of the country you're selling into. So if you're selling DNA equipment into China, it's not illegal in China to forcibly take people's DNA and monitor them. So you're totally fine. So he for one has suggested that laws should be altered so that you have to abide by where you're based and where you're selling as one way of preventing this kind of technology transfer. There's been other efforts to stop this kind of cooperation. People talk a lot about banning trade with particular entities. So earlier this year, the US banned US companies from doing business with another one of the major genetic companies in China called BGI. Thermo Fisher eventually did say that they would stop selling their technology to the police in Xinjiang. So I think there is a sense that maybe not everything's great, but it's a really tricky issue because most corporations are fundamentally set up to make money. They're not there to monitor human rights. And so for them, the most convenient position is to be in a state of willful ignorance or plausible deniability. So it can be really, really difficult to say in any given case how complicit any company is. How much did they know? Should they have known? What choices should they have made?
Yeah, I'll just, I'm sure you've read it, but I'll just point out to the listeners and they can look at the article. The Washington Post recently reported on how a Chinese invention, which is a sophisticated portable laboratory to detect COVID infections, could also be used to harvest and curate very valuable human DNA data in countries around the world, potentially giving China a strategic advantage in developing biotechnology that could produce drugs and disease cures, yes, for good purposes, but also possibly misuse such data. And apparently it's very similar to things that have been used in these DNA collection campaigns in Xinjiang, but also in China's autonomous Tibetan region. And you could use this, according to the article, to identify potential troublemakers, locate their family members, all for the purpose of subjecting people to pressure over their behavior. So let me, I don't want to monopolize this, so let me just close with a question of, because this is one of the themes of Transatlantic Currents. Do you see signs of increasing cooperation among governments outside of China, particularly Western governments, particularly the US, Canada, and let's say the EU, to deal with these risks of Chinese misuse of technologies, at least insofar as they could affect our populations as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I'll just say that all my views here are my own. I definitely feel like the US has been out in front in terms of raising the alarm about potential issues with these technologies, like this lab that you're talking about. I do feel like that message can be sometimes hard to get out effectively because at the same time, there's a number of people in the US who may be engaged in some overheated rhetoric. And so it can be really easily, any legitimate warnings or concerns about Chinese technologies can easily be written off as part of this overheated rhetoric. So I think we do have a messaging, the US does have a messaging problem there. I think that on the technology issue, it seems to be a little bit, we're still in the early phases of that. I know that for example, on the issue of repression in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, as time went on, that started in 2017, and in the ensuing years, it really did feel like more and more Western governments were joining forces to make statements, the UN and other fora. So that became more of a point of cooperation. I do think that there's a bit of a ways to go in terms of technology. And part of that, is really, we talked a little bit about this earlier, there's so many contingent factors when you're making a decision, right? So the Serbia example that you mentioned in the Washington Post, I'm not an expert on Serbia, but I can guess, it's the early days of COVID. You're the Serbian government. What are you going to do? This is offered to you. You need to do something. This is an emergency situation. So maybe you're not going to spend a ton of time thinking about what does this mean for 20 years from now in terms of China's biotech capacity. It's hard to fault them for that. So I do think it's just an enormously challenging issue because people's and governments' priorities change all the time based on what's going on in the world.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. I want to pass it back to Charlie so he can ask questions and communicate some of the questions or comments from our audience. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Leo, and thank you already, Jessica. Great, interesting stuff. I have a bunch of questions. And by the way, I think there are deep China experts, but probably people who don't necessarily know your reference to the A4 white paper protests. So while I go through the questions, do you want to say a few words about it, just since you mentioned it to?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. So last fall, there was a real grassroots upswell of resentment about the increasingly draconian lockdowns in China. People really had been putting up with it for a number of years. We're getting really tired of it. But people also were very aware that saying anything too pointed about the government could get them in a lot of trouble. Some people did, but most people didn't want to. And what they did instead was just hold up pieces of blank paper. And one can think back to kind of Soviet jokes, right? Where you're in the Red Square holding up a piece of paper and the guard says, "What are you doing?" It doesn't say anything. And you're like, but you know what it would say if I could write it.
In Russia, you probably go to jail for about 10 years nowadays because everyone assumes this has to do with a war. So great. No, thank you. I'm going to go look at the questions down here. And has China been able to come up with some peer-reviewed social sciences research, as I said, game-changing results with their elaborate surveillance system, or are they mainly used just for control and abuse? Like, has there been some even putative benefit to social sciences research that you could do with this data, or is it just abusive?
That's really interesting. I don't have a great answer to that question. It's completely possible that there are those peer-reviewed publications out there. I haven't read them. There's no reason for me to think, again, going back to document 9, going back to what we know about the goals of the party state, which is self-preservation, first and foremost, before anything else. There's no reason to think that these technologies are being developed for any purpose other than what they're primarily being deployed for. That said, very, very easy to imagine that you have researchers who are dreaming up ways that these technologies could be used for putatively good reasons. But I personally don't know if those studies exist.
Thank you. Could you go into further detail about how the diaspora is impacted by deepening social control on the mainland?
Yeah. There's a number of ways in which the diaspora is really bearing a huge weight based on what's happening in the region. So one of those we already talked about. They're being contacted by authorities and basically forcibly co-opted into spying on their own communities in the diaspora. And that's enormously damaging. You as a diaspora community in general, one that is not facing repression, you still have this sense of closeness, right? The sense of home with people that you're near. And this dynamic fundamentally breaks that. You don't know who you can trust. You're scared all the time that someone you're talking to could be actually reporting back what you say. So that's just really damaging to the human psyche. You're constantly worried that your family at home is going to be punished for what you do. And you know that anytime you try to contact them, they're being surveilled, you're being surveilled. Anything you do, even not in contact with them, on your own, attend a protest, write something online, that is also being surveilled, and your family at home can pay the price for it. And then there's also just blockades. People are not able to contact their relatives, either because the relatives have cut them off. There's lots of stories of relatives in Xinjiang saying, I can never speak to you again. You're no longer my son. Goodbye. We have to assume that's under duress by the authorities. So people have been completely cut off. A lot of times people don't even know what happened to their family members. So someone just disappeared. Maybe you know, the person in diaspora hears from an aunt or an uncle or a cousin that their mother or father was taken to jail. They don't know why. They don't know for how long. They don't know what their health situation is. So there's an enormous amount of pressure on people in the diaspora to stay quiet. And yeah, just so that they can preserve themselves and their family. It's enormously destructive.
I will continue then with a question which is related to that before I get here. So in Paul Schar's Four Battlegrounds book, which is about AI, he spends a chapter talking about kind of the spread of the technology in various ways, and there's a map of this. What was left a little unclear to me was part of it is just to gather a lot of data. As in fact, one of the people who's interviewed says, you know, this is great. We get data from people from different parts of the world, which helps the model become better. But how much of the fear, which I've heard of also in Finland, considering many of the Helsinki buses, security cameras are by Hikvision and so on, is for the idea of controlling these diaspora and seeing what they're doing versus this broader scare of just being aware of what everyone is doing in country X?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question because, you know, in a lot of cases, we don't know what is actually happening with the data. For example, you have Hikvision cameras at the bus station in Finland, right? You know, I think it's an overstatement to assume that data is being directly fed back to China. We don't know that. I think the important thing to remember is that under Chinese law, if the Chinese government requests data from a company, it must give them that data. So it's really hard to know right now how any of that data is being used. I would suspect, you know, the Chinese government's top priority is not the footage from a bus station in Finland. They don't really care what your average person is doing going into and from work. If they are trying to monitor someone in the diaspora, they probably have much more direct ways of doing that. For, you know, like I said, having WeChat on your phone is a major vulnerability, not just in terms of they can track what you say in WeChat, but it gives all sorts of information about your phone and where you are and other things to the Chinese government. So they're using that to track the diaspora. They might have actual people tailing them. So for those sorts of things, you have way more direct ways of tracking the diaspora. You're probably not that interested in the random footage.
That's what I would figure, not yet least. So this question is, Xinjiang is sometimes called a laboratory where China is testing new surveillance and then spreading it to the rest of the country. Is this happening? How far are they going outside? And was this the plan originally? Test it in one place and then spread it to the whole country?
So I don't think about it this way, actually. The way that I think about it is the Chinese government sets a priority on who they want to surveil and target, who is the most important to them to keep tabs on. And They have shown in recent years that they think that people in northwestern China, particularly Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples, deserve most of their attention. So they are going to throw their best technology and efforts at that region, not necessarily with the goal of we're going to test it here and then move it, but like they're dealing with the most, what they deem the most acute problem first. And I think one of the reasons it might seem like it's a test, or might seem like they're using super cutting edge technologies there and not other places, is simply because of the percentage of people being monitored in the Uyghur region. So half the population there is non-Han. Han is the majority ethnic population in China. And so by the party's lights, half the people in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, just by dint of who they are, deserve this extra level of surveillance, right? Elsewhere in China, that percentage of population that is inherent, quote unquote, inherently threatening is much lower. So even if you do have cameras there, they're just not the same amount. They're not looking at the same swath of the population. So it just feels maybe like Xinjiang is way ahead. I think, certainly we saw with the health codes, right? That's a situation where the threat level changed and everybody in the whole country was potentially a threat in terms of spreading this disease. And so you saw this technology roll out really quickly. So I think it's a response to perceived threats rather than like a test model.
And a reminder that there are limits to resources everywhere and for everyone.
Absolutely.
Next question. Do you know if someone has bridged the surveillance and social engineering methods literatures concerning the China case? I don't know enough about it, so I'm hoping you can interpret what the question is asking.
No, I don't know if I understand what that means. Can you say it again?
Do you know if someone has bridged the surveillance and then separately social engineering methods literature concerning the China case? I'm going to ask Petteri, if you're listening, we may need a clarification on this. All right. Let's see. I posted all the text. That's why I'm scrolling this or the links to see if there are further questions so far. No. Leo, do you want to jump in or?
Yes, I wonder, Jessica, since you've made several references to the bureaucracy behind it, and even with the use of AI, and even with the use of the this other platform that you mentioned, the grid management system, it would seem that the Chinese government or the party or both would have to have tens of hundreds of thousands of people monitoring these things. I mean, just having data that they could never use seems to be an incredible waste of resources. Is there any way to gauge the dimensions, even just the human scale of the effort that the Chinese authorities, possibly, I guess, to include the military, since at least the US government has identified people in the Chinese military that have been accused of hacking, essentially, US system. Is there any way to gauge their level of effort?
So this is a really good question. The really short answer is no. There's so many nooks and crannies in the Chinese bureaucracy where this kind of monitoring happens that you'd have to, I'm just thinking about cameras, right? So we did this piece in 2020 that's looking at surveillance cameras, and the number of different bureaucracies. So you think, okay, the police, they're buying cameras, okay, but also like the water ministry was buying cameras, the United Front Work Department is buying cameras. I can just list like, dozens and dozens of bureaucracies that are buying these cameras. So that alone gives you a sense of like, it's so widespread. Now, probably where you have humans actually sifting through data, more concentrated. The water ministry probably doesn't have people doing that. But the overlap, right? You said, oh, this is a waste. I actually think for them, it's a feature, not a bug. You do want tons of redundancy built into the system. You are so concerned about unrest, about things getting out of control, that you would much rather have that kind of redundancy and that kind of spending than to let something go unchecked. And you know, those A4 protests we were talking about, they went on for a few days, but it's interesting reading some of the commentary about it. It seemed like that was just because the police were really unsure how to respond. It wasn't because they didn't have the capacity. They, in the months, weeks and months after those protests, they were able to use those surveillance cameras to track everyone down. People who thought they were being safe, having masks on, leaving their phones at home. They tracked people down. So maybe the data seems like a waste when you're collecting it, but maybe 3 days later, you realize that it's really actually important to have had all of that footage and all of the different data that you have so that you can go through it.
Thanks.
Since I know there are a few Finnish parliamentarians listening, some other people in civil service, both in Finland and Europe, what concrete policy advice would you then have for Finnish and EU decision makers? Considering all of this, you know, yeah.
I mean, I feel like
there's a great paper where there's a list of these, please point us to that too.
I think that the Atlantic Council actually is doing some really good work, particularly on Chinese efforts abroad involving messaging and technology. So I would suspect that they probably have some good suggestions about things to think about. I'm not primarily a policy analyst, so I don't know that I have. And I'm a domestic. I watch domestic China. I don't think a ton about international relations. So I feel like I'm mostly going to be a disappointment on this front. But I do think the advice I would have is just simply to think about what the domestic reasons are that China would want to do XYZ thing, and that will help you kind of understand why they might be doing it internationally, right? So you asked this question about cameras in Finland, and you know, probably right now they're not that interested in surveilling Finns. Why would they do that? But they're interested in surveilling certain Finns, certainly. You know, Uyghur diaspora who have become Finnish citizens, they still consider that their business. So I think about that, and then I also just think about what implications does that technology have? Okay, so right now they're not using that technology for anything. What are the possibilities in the future? What are the capabilities now, and what are the possibilities in the future? We don't know about the capabilities now. We don't know how that data is being used. We do know that it can be forcibly turned over if you want. And what might that mean 20 years from now?
I am going to add, you said you are looking at things internal to China, but I feel like I have to ask this. Lots of thoughts around Taiwan. And I almost don't yet know how to formulate this question, but it seems like this would be a concern and view on any potential future looking at Hong Kong in terms of surveillance. I imagine it is one of the places that is very interesting, especially since China considers it, well, as it does. Any thoughts on technology use there?
In Taiwan?
Yes.
Yeah, again, I feel like I'm going to be mostly a disappointment. There's been some interesting writing recently, actually, about Taiwanese youth being much more interested in Chinese social media because those products, they're in their native language, they're appealing, you know, young people want to connect with young people all over the world. And I think that that has some interesting implications because as we know, again, any data that is collected by a Chinese company can be turned over to the Chinese government at any time that is written into Chinese law. So that's the only thing that I am honestly really aware of because that touches so much on the domestic situation. I don't have any insight into how other surveillance technologies are being deployed or not in Taiwan.
Leo?
Um, the New York Times did a piece recently. They've done a couple of interesting pieces just to call to the attention of our audience. One was an editorial focused mainly on more on economic and security issues, the kind of the traditional things that preoccupy U.S. government officials, and kind of arguing that the U.S. should not go too far in this, that we also have interests with China and so forth and so on. So in a way, it was an appeal for a swing in the pendulum back towards a more balanced, what they would argue would be a more balanced program of seeking cooperation with China, as well as recognizing the competitive nature of our relationship. There was a separate article, I believe it was a separate article in the New York Times, talking about what appears to be an intentional Chinese policy to create a real sense of paranoia in the Chinese population about the West. Spies are everywhere, you have to be on your guard and so forth. This is kind of the flip side of surveillance of their own population, but also use, in a way, I would think of social control. If you make the population internally more afraid of contacts with foreigners, you open the gates towards, more control. Have you given some thought to the very broad question, but to the generational impact that this could have over time, and really making it more difficult to do what the New York Times editorial is arguing, is to keep in mind the benefits of close, or at least of some areas of cooperation with China. If you have a Chinese population that, broadly speaking, becomes more fearful over time of any contact with the West.
Yeah, this is something that's been written about a lot in the last few months. A couple of really interesting articles about various parts of the Chinese bureaucracy trying to enlist all of the citizenry to help hunt out foreign spies. So there was a counter-espionage law that went into effect earlier this year. And I do think that this is really troubling for a number of reasons. As you said, there's this psychological barrier that goes up between Chinese citizens and foreigners, and I just do not think that is good for the world in general. People should be able to have ordinary business and social contacts, and in fact, that strengthens. These very informal ties are the things that help buffer the relationship when there is tensions at the government to government level, right? It's got really harmful consequences for Chinese citizens too. I've read, kind of anecdotal stories of people being accused of being a spy when they weren't. And so you're in this state where you have half the people running around looking for spies and the other half being suspected. And for neither of those people is that a pleasant state to live in, right? And as you said, it does have this rally around the flag effect. I don't know how deeply that goes for any person, but it does have this appearance of boosting nationalism and possibly xenophobia. I think back, actually, this makes me think back to when I was a college student and I was studying in China, and I was a linguistics student. And so what I was trying to do was a sociolinguistic survey about the use of different terms of address in China, and just trying to approach people in China to get them to take my survey. And I basically was unable to get any people maybe over the age of 50 to even talk to me about it. They were so mistrustful of a foreigner asking them to take a survey. And when I talked to my advisor and other people, they were like, that is just a generational thing, right? From the time that they grew up, foreigners asking them to fill out forms, very, very suspect. But I didn't have that problem with people younger. And so now this makes me think like, oh man, are we going to go back to a time where that's where we are again, where, again, this was a totally innocent, I was a 21-year-old kid. I had no idea what I was doing. I definitely wasn't going to use this information in any nefarious way. And, that kind of stuff is going to be stifled. Who knows for how long? I do think it's enormously troubling.
Right. I'm been to do with stifling things. Here's a question: do you believe the ongoing over-securitization in China? I assume not from the Chinese authorities' perspective, over-securitization stifles their economic growth and entrepreneurial activities. Do you see a correlation between the two?
I think it depends on what industry you're talking about. There's going to be continued innovation in AI, surveillance technology, computers, all of that stuff. Anything science, anything that can be used and harnessed by the party state to further its own aims. It may hurt other industries, more creative industries, but maybe not. I mean, I feel like one of the arguments against censorship in China is that, the material that you're producing is less interesting, but the box office has loved in China these wolf warrior style movies that show Chinese heroes doing great things in China and the world over. So I'm not sure, but I wouldn't say that the crackdowns are necessarily going to stifle innovation. There's plenty of field writ large, because there's plenty of fields that the Chinese government would like innovation to continue, and it can continue in those fields. Others, maybe.
All right. I see there's one last question here, and then I think we're going to wrap up. You've addressed this in many ways, but I'll hear, has surveillance tech been exported to any other country? There's some reporting about Pakistan deploying similar tech. Before you answer, I'll just point out that in this Paul Schar's book, just looking at 2008 to 2019, there's a map which geographically covers most of the world and is at least 80 countries, and some very deeply integrated. So I would guess the simple answer is yes.
Yeah, and it's hard to track because some of these, again, are happening at the company level, company to company. Sometimes it's company to government, sometimes it's government to government. So it can be complicated to wrap your head around exactly all the ways that this is happening. But certainly, both technologies such as individual cameras are being sold out, but also entire platforms. So there's instances of Chinese companies offering, a comprehensive monitoring system to governments, and those governments can choose to set them up in whatever way they want. And I think these are really appealing, especially to non-democratic governments, because there is not necessarily a popular check on the way that these surveillance technologies can be used. Again, it goes back to the question of how are they actually being implemented in that country? Is any of that data being shipped back to China? We don't know. But certainly there's autocratic governments the world over that are very excited about buying comprehensive platforms that help them monitor what's going on in their own societies.
All right. Well, I think I was going to say on that happy note, but I guess that dystopian note may be more so. I would like to thank you, Jessica. This has been brilliantly insightful hour. Leo, for making it possible and leading the discussion, interviewing the beginning, and then the audience for questions as well as participating in this. And with this, I'm going to say thank you, and this webinar is closed.